elections within months of these taking place. Information, I think, is actually a very important thing. Now, Dr. Theresa Reedy, who talked to the Commission earlier, was talking about the importance of maybe getting the Commission established before the next election. Now, there are certain things the Commission can't do in a short space of time, but one thing a new Commission could do very quickly is work on getting electoral information out to people. I had a quick look yesterday at the British Electoral Commission. You look at their webpage, they've got details on how to register, details all on the front of their webpage. In the case of Ireland, if you want to get that information, I was looking at it, you probably need to go to websites. You've got to go through the Department of the Environment website for certain information, and even at that you need to go through a number of different links. You've got to go to the SIPO website or the local authority websites, or sometimes a number of them, political party websites, returning officers, etc., etc. So definitely information would be something that I think would be an important function for an electoral commission. And this is something that the Commission could work on very early in the day. Probably the very first thing the Commission could do, just a one-stop shop in terms of getting information about the electoral process, important statistics on elections to the public that they can go to very quickly and get that information ready at hand. This is something that websites such as Sean's electionsireland.org and even my own website is doing at the moment. So this would probably take away all our business, but it's probably for the best. Other things in relation to information, the Commission should be involved in carrying out research in terms of better electoral practice and so on. There may be scope for funding PhD scholarships in relation to this, but also very important, the Commission should be involved in voter education programmes. So the funding of directed voter education programmes focusing on particularly on areas or groups that generally tend to have low turnouts, either for specific elections, such as, say, Donegal for referendum elections, or groups that generally always tend to have low turnouts. So, for instance, inner-city populations, younger voters, and so on. Two very quick points, because, to be honest, there's others here with better opinions on this. Value for money. In relation to value for money, there may be an argument that centralisation and economies of scale may work. On the other hand, as we've seen in the past, new initiatives have often produced false economies and a problem of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So what I would be very careful, argue against, is kind of just going in, I would definitely argue against a new electoral commission going in and trying to reinvent the wheel from stage one. Generally, what I'd suggest, probably the best practice, is to see what's already there and generally look in terms of how a new commission could link between these different bodies. Finally, on administration, generally, I think the best model, in my own perspective or opinion, might be an electoral commissions body. So generally, instead of the commission basically replacing SIPO, instead of the commission replacing the referendum commission, the electoral commission generally should be an umbrella grouping tying together these different bodies with the chief electoral officer or electoral ombudsman or ombudsperson, generally their main role is to try and link between them, the different bodies, in relation to different parts of electoral practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kavanagh. Now, Sean Donnelly.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for the invitation. People like me are often referred to as psephologists. It's a Greek word from Cephos, silent P, which means pebble, because in ancient Greece they used to vote by casting pebbles. They may be using something else now in the next few weeks in Greece, but psephology is a branch of political science that deals with the study and scientific analysis of elections. I have a fair bit of experience with our elections. I've written 10 books since 1991 on all of our elections, from general elections to by-elections, European elections, presidential elections, referenda, the whole lot. Just a few figures when we're talking about elections. There's been 31 general elections in this state since 1922, which was the first PR election. There's been 131 by-elections, 28 Seanades, 8 European elections, 7 presidential elections, 39 referenda, 24 local elections. So there's 268 elections, so we have a fair bit of experience of the electoral process, I would argue. I will deal with my own experience over the last 30 years. There's 4 items in particular, problems that I had. The lack of overall control, no one in charge of the overall system, no consistency, no one in charge, left hand not knowing what the right hand was doing and not particularly interested. The internet ethos of sharing information has not permeated to these bodies. Information is power ethos overrides transparency aspiration, I'm afraid. The register of electors, the most talked about item in this committee, I would gather. It's well documented in the hearings. I'll be saying something else about it. Obviously a big item. And the election results, because of the attitude, that is very, very deficient. It relies on people like myself and others to come up with election results, and that's not good enough. Some possible solutions to these problems. The first one, lack of transparency and overall, the establishment of an electoral commission will solve that problem overnight. Item 2, which is on the sharing of information, that requires a cultural change, and I don't think it can happen, and that's why we need an electoral commission. I've dealt a lot with all the councils in regards to the register. Anytime you want information, it's 34 phone calls, but it's a lot more than 34 by the time you get the information. The first answer you get is, what do you want that for? You ring the CSO and they can't do enough for you. It's that culture change that needs to take place. And one of the things I'd be looking for in particular would be the breakdown of the electoral register. Like, purely just the way the books are structured, book VB, so many votes. And you'd ask them for that information. No, we don't have that. And I said, but you should have it. No, we don't have it. I said, but you used to sell the register and parts of the register. Yeah, so you must have a list of the books with the number of voters on it. Oh, is that what you're talking about? Or then, no, we don't have that. And then you'd say to them, but you have enumerators that go out and update the register, and they're paid on the number of people on the register. So you must have a list. Oh, is that what you're talking about? So there's all this sort of not knowing what you want and not particularly interested in helping you. To go on to the register of electors, if we look at 3 items, the census, the boundary report for our elections, and the register of electors. The responsibility of the census is the Central Statistics Office. The unit they deal with is population. The latest one is 2011 census, and there was 4,588,252 people in Ireland on that. But the building block of the census is something called the electoral division. If we go on to the boundary report, and the building block of it is also the electoral division. We then go on to the register of electors, and it's now in the hands of 3 city councils and 28 county councils. They deal with the electorate. 2015 is the latest electorate. But what their benchmark, their building block, is something called polling district, which I haven't been able to find out how it actually came about or what it means. So here you have a Tower of Babel with electoral division as the building block of the census and of the boundary committee, which forms the boundaries for the actual elections. And then you have this something different in the register of electors. So you can't get the two to coordinate. And again, because of the lack of an overarching body, 2 county councils do it right, or 2 city councils rather, Dublin City Council and Cork City Council, they actually do it right, but the rest of them don't. So again, the left hand not knowing, but it gives a problem with doing any sort of analysis because, as I say, it's a Tower of Babel, talking different languages, and there's no need for it. I give an example in my submission of how you can compare the electorate and break it down into these small EEDs, but even looking at a local electoral area, the one I do there is in Dublin Bay South for the next election. And you're able to compare, something I brought in is the electorate per population. In other words, the number of the population that are able to vote. They're Irish and they're over 18. And it works out, the figures that come out about 70%. That means 30% can't vote. Now you could use that figure working down to the EDs, and it would immediately throw up where there's over voters registered, too many voters registered. It would throw up all sorts of stuff which I've found over the years. For instance, if you apply it to the state, the last census, that percentage comes out at 71%. But in Dublin City, it's as low as 61%. And in Ulster, it's as high as 77%. But if you can integrate the population, the census, and they are the same thing, they're all off the same thing. People, population, it's all the same. And there shouldn't be this discrepancy between the two. The CSO are an excellent body. They produce excellent reports. They couldn't do enough for you. And someone like them could take over this part, the electoral register. They have the expertise there, I'm sure, to overcome the problem of PPS numbers or whatever solutions come up with. They have the expertise. But we're going to have a census next year, and it would be handy if the census got a note from government to say, listen, could you ever form the census in a way that will know the number of people that should be able to vote? At the moment, they have a grouping of 0 to 19, but what we would want is a grouping from 0 to 18. Why 19? What does 19 mean? I don't know what it means. I mean, it has no significance, but 18 has a significance. You can vote. So even a simple thing like that. But that information is actually available from the CSO. If you pay them €50, they can come out of their database that they have. So the model is there. The CSO is there. The census is there with all of the details you need. The problem with the duplication, I can leave that to other experts, be it PPS or whatever they come up with. Another big gap in the system is the election results. And again, very, very difficult to get them. They don't see it as part of trying to get election results. I mean, you see general elections in Italy and it's in the local piazza on a big screen as it's happening. You'd be lucky to get the information from the councils 6 months later. The local elections we haven't got yet. The future, as I see it, I mean, we're now in the internet age, and we always hear, everything changes with the internet. It hasn't changed in our electoral system. It's had absolutely no effect. I mean, when I started off trying to get information, they'd have to post it to you. I remember trying to get election results, and they said, oh, we'll have to post it. We only have the big sheets that were up in the election count. That was their system. I remember the presidential election, I was on radio at lunchtime on the Saturday giving out about the system. And then Claire Byrne says, we have to go over to one of the Dublin counts in the new convention centre. And the RT reporter was there, and said, we can't get the fax working. In this day and age, they're using the fax in the new convention centre. Claire Byrne says, we're having to restrain Sean Donnelly here. He's about to fall off the chair. But that's typical of it. We're now in the age, everything is analysis. Everything is statistics. I mean, you see the American football analysis now and rugby and in the last few years in GAA. I mean, there was a stat there, Michael Murphy, my own county Donegal, touched the ball 50 times. Is that good or bad? Paul O'Connell playing for Ireland made 16 tackles. Is that good or bad? Sporting people know that's very, very good. But if the turnout in Kerry at 6 o'clock on the day of voting in the last election was 40%, is that good or bad? We don't know. We have nothing to compare it with. And all of this, it's all about statistics nowadays. And sport in particular is used, and it's coming in everywhere. A few years ago, I came across a book. It's called Slater's National Commercial Directory of Ireland. And it had broke down the country into baronies, parishes, statute acres, annual value, population, families, population per family, education, neither read the whole thing. And I thought, God, this must be very recent. And I looked at the date, 1846, that was produced. It puts us in the shade. 1846. It's the pre-famine figures. The population then, pre-famine, was over 8,175,000. And interestingly, I just did an analysis of that. The families at that stage, the household was 5.6 people per family. In the last census there were 2.8. It had halved. If we were back at the 5.6, we would be back to the pre-famine population. You could argue contraception had as big an effect on our population as the famine had. When you get figures like that, an incredible 1846 published in Manchester. And here we are. The tally, just dealing briefly with the tally, because some of this comes up, it's a revered position in Irish politics, and I think it's completely overrated. Counting votes as they're opened is no rocket science, and to have the results a few hours before the official, big deal. I set the task in 1994 of doing a Euro tally in Dublin, full Euro tally. They said it couldn't be done. This is pre-Windows 95, pre-internet, pre the whole shebang. And because there was something like 1,300 boxes, and to put them into a computer would take about 22 hours. We had about 4. So the obvious solution was to get a pile of computers. I drove around Dublin, I got 12 computers, and we had one master computer, and the old floppy disk, you know, the old style floppy disk. And every hour we stopped the count and we went around, and we produced a tally at that time. There's a photocopier there for the parties, and all the media got it. Worked like a charm. 30 years ago that was done. In 2005, there was 2 by-elections, one in Kildare for Charlie McCreevy's seat and one for John Bruton's seat up in Meath. Decided to go one better. Could we put the tally on the internet? And we put it on the internet on the mobile phones as it was happening. And an interesting thing about that tally, because people talk about tallies and that, I was just looking at the figures. You have to go to 2 decimal places to get even any differences. But it's the one time I was able to get all the parties decided to do their own tallies, and then they pass them on to me. And the tallies, they hardly differed. The Fianna Fáil tally, like for the Fine Gael candidate, was 33.98%. The Fine Gael tally was 34%. The Sinn Féin tally was 33.95%. My own tally was 34.05%. The actual vote was 34.13%. There's always less than 0.1%. So it shows you what can be done by individual people. What could you do with the powers of the state behind you? So I feel passionate about this electoral commission. If you look at the turnout in particular, election day, a slow news day. So what do? RT send their correspondents all over the country checking in on polling stations. How many ballot papers have you given out? One phone call from each polling station to an internet site, and you'd have it on the hour, any polling station in the country you'd want to see. That's the way. Look what they did in 18, whatever year it was, and what we're doing now. The elephant in the room, electronic voting. I was one of the few that publicly supported this. In fact, all the political parties supported it in the Dáil. Electronic voting wasn't the problem. Electronic counting became a problem. They all found the voting machines worked pretty well. I believe that if there had been an electoral commission then, we wouldn't have got into the debacle we got into. It wouldn't have become a political issue and we would have saved ourselves over €50 million. So these things are important. Now, the validity of the arguments raised by the computer buffs could have easily been checked by the election after that. Selecting a few constituencies and feeding all the ballot papers into the electronic voting machines and see if it differed. If it differed hugely, grand. But if you put in 3 or 4 or 5 complete ballots into it, and it came very, very close, and I believe it would have come close, because we're not sure of the present system. I've never seen a recount actually produce the exact same recount, same figures. But I know it then became a political football and the whole thing, and nobody wants to touch it. I believe it will be touched. In summary, I've outlined the main deficiencies in our present electoral management system and the necessity for the establishment of an electoral commission. Now, some people say these things aren't important, but one of the things, because of this sort of laissez-faire attitude, is if we look at the referenda and we talk about the Third Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, or whatever it is, that means that the last one we had was supposed to be the 34th Amendment to the Constitution. It was actually the 29th. There have only been, before that, only 28 referenda passed by the people. So, and they used to do it right at the start. The Third and Fourth Amendment, if it wasn't passed, they brought the number forward. So the Third and Fourth Amendment, they had 2 goes at passing that. But then we got into the 11th and 12th Amendment. There was 3 amendments in one day, 2 passed, 1 didn't. They carried the number on. And then there was another time, and it didn't. It was about judges calling judges to hang or something. It didn't actually go through at all, but they carried the number on. So the next referendum that we'll be sitting down to do, whenever it is, we'll be calling it the 36th Amendment, and it'll actually be the 30th. Now that's sloppy. Can you imagine the Americans pleading the 5th and wondering is it the 6th, the 7th, or the 8th? You know, I mean, that is sloppy. And maybe somebody will make will have a case against it sometime. 4 recommendations: an electoral commission to be established with responsibility for all aspects of our electoral system, including voter and party registration, reviews of boundary divisions, organisation and running of the various elections and referenda, and publication of results and analysis. The Register of Electors, a national Register of Electors to be set up based on electoral divisions as per the census and the boundary reviews rather than polling districts as at present. The 2006 census form to be altered to allow for the calculation of the population allowed to vote. This is not available in the present, but can be made available. The register to be the responsibility of the Electoral Commission, but could be contracted out to a body like the CSO, who carry out similar work in compiling the census every 5 years, and we have one next year. They would also have the expertise to tackle the ongoing problem of voter duplication. A comprehensive website to be set up containing all relevant data associated with the electoral process, including the register of electors and read-time election results. Reading time, not 6 months later. It should include all historical results. In other words, it should contain the data contained in my 10 books on the Elections Ireland website. Electronic voting to be revisited, and like a few recent referenda, may get through at the 2nd attempt. It will bring us to the internet age with instant and much more detailed results. It will be the end of the tally, but it has been overrated anyway. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Donnelly, very much for that very interesting contribution. Now it's the turn of Mr. Davitt from the Irish Local Government Association.
I'm feeling passionate after listening to Sean Donnelly here. Very inspiring stuff here. So I suppose just firstly, just the people might know, we're representing the AILG, which is the Irish Association of Irish Local Government. We're delighted to be asked to make a submission here today, and we have 949 councillors throughout Ireland at present. So we're representing all the particular councillors. The submission was put together after much discussion at our plenary committee and executive committees. We have a detailed submission which is very broad, dealing with all aspects from registration to logistics on the day, boundary commissions, diaspora, or diaspora, of course, as has been mentioned here by some of our other contributors here as well. Just briefly, a response and opinion on the establishment of the Electoral Commission. County and city councils have in law a valuable mandate, and I quote, promote interest among young people in democracy and local government and in community and civic affairs generally. That was in the Local Government Act 2001. Many local authorities are active in this manner, including hosting local meetings of Dáil and Óg and other educational activities, such as facilitating groups of youths to council chambers and arranging for local visits to mayors to schools and that type of thing. The maintenance of local government capacity to organise and administer elections is intertwined. Its mandate to educate and interest young people and the community generally in democracy. So I suppose that's one of the main, one of our main topics and one of the things we feel exceptionally strongly about. I'm just going to hand you over to Damien Gagan here, or Peter McVitie here next to follow on.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman. Just a couple of issues on the current features of the electoral system and the current system. Elected administration working from the bottom up includes the following. We've just made a few points here. The local authorities which have multiple responsibilities in the election process, including responsibilities for the local elections, administration, organisation, including the maintenance of the register and electors, but also making the polling schemes, the provision of the logistics in relation to the election, assistance to the county register in organisation of elections, formal and informal provision for personal assistance to elections. Also maintain the register for spending by parties and the candidates in local elections. The county register, who is independent, he or she functions within the remit of the court service of the Department of Justice. County Registers has many other responsibilities relating to the court administration, sheriff functions, etc. This is also the returning officer for the general elections and the sub returning officer of presidential, the Dáil of the European parliamentary elections and the referendums. The Department of Environment Franchise Unit drafts the monitor policy and the legislation regarding the electoral system. The Referendum Commission, a temporary commission which is activated in the weeks preceding the referendum and then lapse after the referendum. The main role for the Commission is to give impartial information as regards the referendum issues in question. Boundary committees, which is established from time to time to redraw the constituency boundaries from separately, parliamentary constituencies and local electoral areas. Such committees are temporary in their nature. And finally, the standard in the public commission functions mainly relating to the declaration of spending by parties and the candidates in the general election and the maintenance of the register and the lobbyists. So, Chairman, there's just a few points we put together, and I think I'll go over to Damien here now.
We've also put together a critique of the savings claimed for the establishment of a commission. The proponents of a single electoral commission argue that by centralising some or all of the above functions into a central organisation there would be cost and efficiency savings. It is also argued that a body with a focused remit on electoral administration would do a job more effectively than, say, county councils or county registrars, for whom electoral administration is just a part of their overall responsibilities. To assess the usefulness of such claims, we believe the following should be taken into account. As regards the savings claimed, we'd make the following points. The local authorities will continue in existence regarding all other functions, so any saving on the franchise side, we would see that as being minimal. Similarly, the county registrars for court purposes will continue in existence, so any savings in regard to their time involved in election administration would also be small. Regarding the franchise unit at the Department of the Environment, it is certain that even if a one-stop electoral commission was to be set up, the Department of the Environment would still need an office dealing with broad policy and the drafting of electoral legislation. A transfer of functions to a new electoral commission could in time lead to a duplication of work. Standards in Public Offices Commission. As regards administration of election spending, it is true that SEPO and the local authorities operate parallel systems for different cohorts of elected members. There may be some savings possible by developing a common template for such returns. However, as regards integrating SEPO with an electoral commission, there is an argument that the standards body should stand alone, given its very specific role in relation to maintaining propriety and standards. The Referendum Commission. The approach to the Referendum Commission is essentially ad hoc, with a commission being called into office as a referendum is called. There have been complaints that the short period in office of the Commission does not allow it to sufficiently convey its information in advance of the referendum. This is one area where integration with a more continuous body could help in terms of conveying information to the public and enhancing voter turnout. That said, the experience of the May 2015 same-sex marriage referendum would show that the existing system operated by the county councils was able to cope with a surge of new registrations within a matter of weeks before the election. Taking all the above into account, there is a question as to whether a single body as proposed would in fact deliver appreciable savings and at a cost of losing local knowledge and involvement. Christy is going to take the next section.
Thank you. Christy Hyland from Municipal District of West Mayo, and thank you for your invitation here today. The areas mostly have been covered by my colleagues, and I will be brief. I'm conscious of time, but I wanted to be recognised that the input of local authorities into electoral arrangements and registers, it must never be diluted, because they have a valuable resource of local knowledge there, and I think it's an area that should never be interfered with. Why we make a mess at times of the register, we've only a population of 4.5 million people, and time again, as each election takes place, we can never get it right regarding the register. And one system that we would put forward is that the moment a citizen reaches the age of 18 years of age, that you engage with the Department of Social Protection, who will notify that citizen when they become 18 to register for their vote. It's very simple. It's not rocket science. And that is the opinion of the Association of Irish Local Government. Another area that we feel very strongly about is that on election day, when each of us want to exercise our constitutional right to hear, look, and go in and cast our vote, the first people we meet there are the polling clerks or the presiding officer. And we feel very strongly on this. And those people, go here, look, the presiding officer and the polling clerk, 99% of the time, they're people who are in full-time employment. They're public servants. They either work for the Department of Education or Department of Justice or whatever, Department of the Environment. When we have qualified young people, especially as our association feel very strongly about, third-level graduates. Third-level graduates who are in full-time education who may be studying politics. These are the people that should be employed on the day of the count. It's worth 400 to 500 euros to a person that's employed at the day we cast our vote at the polling station. And that 400 or 500 euro to a third-level student, very important. And time again, for years, we hear after the election about who was employed in the polling station. And we still haven't got it right. And our association feels very strong. It's now time to call a halt to this situation that you have public servants, serving public servants who take annual leave on the day of the election and are employed in the polling booth. It's a crying shame and it has to stop. And we are getting this every day. There's 949 of us throughout the country, and every day we are getting this. And we feel very strongly on that. Another area is polling cards. A polling card is not an identification card. An identification card is your driving licence or your passport. And people need to be well informed that a polling card, they do not have to have it with them the day of when they want to cast their vote. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, before we go to the
just in conclusion, if you're happy, Cahier, look, I suppose just lastly, and just the last point I'd like to make, we feel, and it's something that we get on the doorstep quite regularly, and we're only after an election in the last year. The diaspora really have to be accommodated. That is something that came across very strong from our members. And again, just to thank you, and thank you for taking our submission.
Thank you, Mr. David. I'm going to begin with one or two points myself, and I'm going to just direct this to the people from the Department of Social Protection and possibly the Data Protection Commissioner. The extent to which the Department of Social Protection share PPSN information, I presume that that your department would be in consultation or liaise with Revenue, for example, in relation to PPSN. What's the extent of that involvement, of that interaction, and how many other public bodies would the Department of Social Protection be in interaction with around the issue of PPSN? And why, as the suggestion came just on the floor, why isn't there a system in place? And we have many organs of the state who collate a lot of similar information. Some that have it at their disposal, others that go to very extreme lengths to get that information that is already in the possession of some other organs of the public sector, which is almost kind of a dog chasing its tail in many respects. So why isn't there, for example, an interaction between the franchise, there may be, and if there is, I stand to be corrected, why isn't there an interaction, for example, between the Department of Social Protection and our various local authorities? Because it's the one department that knows everyone's date of birth, everyone's date of death, those who would have provided, or representatives of those, for example, who would see social welfare payments applied for bereavement grants in the past. So where does that interaction, why doesn't it happen, for example, with local authorities in terms of compiling the electoral register? Or maybe it does. Would you might just clarify that? Second point that I have, and I want to direct this to Sean Donnelly and perhaps Dr. Kavanagh. I'm intrigued by the whole polling situation. It's my view now that we've arrived at a situation in terms of political writing from our newspapers. The standard, I think, is absolutely appalling nowadays, generally appalling. I think a lot of the stuff online is just clickbait in terms of, you know, aspects of politics that I wouldn't find in the least bit interesting. But I think one of the features in recent times of newspapers trying to sell are the whole issue of opinion polls. And it generally is front page stuff. I mean, most people around here will be exercised, for example, by the Sunday Business Post Red Sea poll, which is the only tracking poll of its kind. There are other polls, and they can vary greatly. You give two papers the same weekend, one has, and this is for party political polling, One is, 5 or 6 points of a difference between another. I mean, it couldn't possibly couldn't be correct. Now, there are two significant developments in recent times. One was the whole polling situations before the UK general election. And I looked into this afterwards, and I was surprised to learn there was a polling commission in the United Kingdom who had launched an investigation into why. Now, either the polls got it wrong or the people got it wrong. I would obviously deduce that the polls got it wrong. Where is the accuracy there, and where's the level of account that needs to be held for polling companies? I mean, the science of of what they do, the accuracy of what they do, the data that they use, and all of that. I mean, there is absolutely no way of knowing how scientific it is, and it's all, in my view, there to drive the sales of newspapers. And the other significant one is a very homegrown problem. This is a homegrown example. The week of the Shannon referendum, I campaigned against the abolition of that. I just thought it was absolutely appalling that any government would want to reduce a bicameral system down to a unicameral system. And I campaigned against that proposition to abolish the Shannon. And it was my experience that the word on the street and the feedback from canvassers was that people were going to reject this. But the Irish Times did a poll that week that predicted that the Shannon would go. In other words, the result of the election, the referendum, was a foregone conclusion, and they got it horribly wrong. It was completely wrong. But there was no fallback. There was no one held to accountability. I mean, if that was a minister and they made a statement to that effect and it was ruled grossly or widely inaccurate by plebiscite a week later, you'd hear about it from, till the cows have come home. So where's the role, or should there be a role, for polling in the Electoral Commission? And if and when the Electoral Commission is up and running, should they have a remit to monitor that type of behaviour? Because sometimes I think this can influence voters, and it might have that unhealthy influence. So I do recall the 97-02 administration, about 2000-2001, attempted to bring in legislation banning opinion polls. And there was an anomaly spotted in the legislation. It had passed the Dáil. It was in the final stages in the Shannon, and one of the members of the Shannon spotted an anomaly, and the whole thing was just abandoned. Legislation was withdrawn. So the question in essence is this: in terms of an electoral commission, does it need to have a remit in terms of polling? Because there's such a kind of a wide inconsistency around how that information is fed to us, and particularly why that information is fed to us. Now, to begin with the questions, maybe Mr. Duggan might answer the social protection. If Ms. Dixon feels there's a response from her own office, and then Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Kavanagh.
Okay, Chairman. Interaction with other departments. First of all, can I explain that I said in my opening statement that the PPS number is available to bodies that are known as specified bodies. And the way they are specified is by being included in a schedule to the 2005 Consolidation Act, Social Welfare 2005 Consolidation Act. If I just hold this up, you'll see that the list runs to over 2 pages as it currently stands. And they're general descriptions, by the way. So number 2 on the list is local authorities. So local authorities do have the legislative power to collect and use PPS numbers. In the same way that revenue and any other government department does, because they are specified in that schedule to the Act. The second thing is that we make the public service identity data set, which was all those things I listed earlier: name, address, date of birth, place of birth, PPS number. All of those are made available through a system called the Single Customer View, and local authorities do have entitlement to access that system to verify that data. Then the third thing is that there is a system called the Debt Event Notification System, which takes debt information registered with the GRO and disseminates it again through the Single Customer View infrastructure to any public body that is entitled to that information and that subscribes to it. And that does include all local authorities. So in short, local authorities do have the ability to check and validate PPS numbers, check and validate all public service identity that's offered to them by an individual, and check if people have died and are so registered.
Thank you, Mr. Duggan. Commissioner.
Just briefly, Chairman, you were asking why, for example, at the moment, data that the Department of Social Protection has, perhaps the details of those that have reached aged 18, isn't shared automatically with the local authorities. And this would simply be because there isn't currently a legal basis in primary legislation for this data sharing. So in order for data of this type to be shared, it would have to be underpinned with specific primary legislation providing for it.
Interesting. Okay. Just on the issue of the polls, I've got to Dr. Kavanagh and Sean Donnelly.
I was looking at the polls coming up to the last general election, and the exit poll was fairly close. Actually, I got Fine Gael 36.10, and they got 36.10, so you can't get much closer than that. They underestimated the Fianna Fáil vote by 2 points. But if you look at the average going back, and the one thing people have to remember is you're allowed to change your mind coming up to election day, and this often happens in referenda. You are. No, because you said to a poster 2 weeks ago you were going to vote for Fianna Fáil, that doesn't tie you into voting for Fianna Fáil. You have free issue on this. And people, there have been problems, but people now, I think the main polling companies, like for the Irish Times, for the Sunday Business Post and that, have a very good record, an excellent record, I would say. There are rogue polls published, and you should be very much aware of them. The Sunday Independent used to produce, before the last election, constituency polls, and they must have been done in the back of an envelope. They're absolutely rubbish. They were terrible. And stuff like that shouldn't be allowed. Definitely, that should not be allowed, because it gives an awful, everybody a bad name. As regards the Electoral Commission having some sort of a role in this, I'd be wary of that. I think it's part of our system now. I know in France they stopped it for the last week of the campaigns or something. There was a proposal about that before, but that can work against you. I mean, Bertie Ahern was heading for an overall majority until polls leaked out that he was going that way, and Michael McDougall got up at a lamppost and it all changed. So it can work both ways. People get frightened of maybe an overall majority and roll back, and you have to, you're in the game. You have to go with it, I think. But to say, I think in general the polls have been pretty good over the years. Okay, everybody's talking about the British thing. I don't know enough about the British thing to give any view on that. Adrian?
I generally would agree with everything that Sean said there. Just a few points on my take on things. In relation to the British election, looking at the poll of polls taken on the day of the election, the main issue really was, I think, Labour's percentage share of the vote was maybe 2%, 3% lower than expected. Conservatives, 3%. All the other parties were pretty much bang on. I think the poll of polls had predicted UKIP would be around 13, 14%, and that's where they finished. The Greens would be around 4%. The problem in the case of the United Kingdom was translating those poll figures into seat numbers. And a lot of people kind of didn't take account of the fact that the UK uses a first-past-the-post electorate. Obviously, that was a factor, but the knock-on effect of the big swing, the large swing to the SNP in Scotland, which meant that the Labour's number of seats would be drastically reduced as a result. So they would probably have had to be even above the Conservatives overall to have had a chance of winning more seats than them. So the main issue probably in relation to polls is how do you translate polls into seat numbers? And that's a big issue. Like, a lot of people we have a proportional electoral system, but it's not proportional. Like, in the last election, for instance, Fianna Fáil, who generally have won up to 2009, were winning seat bonuses at nearly every local or general election. They won 17% of the votes in 2011, but only 12% of the seats. So there's no nice, neat relationship between actual percentage share of the vote and seat numbers. The other thing to note as well in relation to, say, the recent opinion polls, there is a margin of error associated with polls. I think most polls tend to have about 1,000 respondents, and the margin of error is around 3%. So if Fine Gael were on 25%, it's probably feasible that one poll might have them at 22%, another poll could have them at 28%. So that's another thing to account of. In relation to the Seanad referendum, this also points to the issue in relation to turnout. If turnout is low, then opinion polls are probably less reliable than would be the case if you're talking about a general election, where generally turnout levels would generally tend to be much higher. So I think the issue with the Seanad referendum, it mightn't have been as inaccurate, the poll, as was expected. Maybe the issue there was people wanted to vote yes, not enough of them turned out to vote, and the no voters were more likely to turn out. Finally, on the constituency polls, Sean made a very good point there. Generally, as I would agree with Sean, that most of our national polls at present are generally quite consistent, generally quite accurate, but there is a problem with constituency opinion polls, and usually the number of respondents are much lower. And when you have a lower number of respondents, if you have only 200 respondents, the reliability of these, the margin of error, the smaller the number of respondents, the margin of error gets much larger as a return. And usually with these constituency opinion polls, there's a name recognition factor. So I remember in Laois Offaly, maybe not the last election, I think they had Brian Cowan at 33% in the opinion poll. It's the TDs generally tend to have higher, the people who have higher name recognitions generally tend to have higher poll ratings as a result. Whereas in an election campaign, after campaigning, other candidates will probably catch up as a result. So constituency polls are perhaps the most problematic area there.
Thank you, Dr. Cameron. Now we're going to go to Deputy Brian Stanley first. What you might do, Deputy Stanley, in an effort to be kind of helpful to our witnesses, if you have particular questions around particular witnesses, direct it to them, because otherwise we'll be going on in circles.
Firstly, I want to thank members of the panel for coming in. The ALG, the new amalgamated body out of the AMAI and the General Council, Liam and the delegation, and also the other members of the panel. And I want to thank Adrian for that last bit of good news that he said in relation to in elections the TDs have name recognition advantage. But anyway, maybe sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. But anyway, the question in relation to, and Helen might take this one, just in relation to, she mentioned that there's an over-reliance on one identifier, the PPS number, and I'm just wondering, has she any suggestions as to what else could be used? The questions around, from the AILG, there's a few questions arising out of the presentation, and I mean, I would have a natural bias, and Liam, I suppose, and some of them would know this, towards local government in terms of trying to have a local government take on as many responsibilities as possible. But I've been trying to reconcile this in relation to the electoral process, and I'm just wondering, how, does the delegation have any, from AILG, have any suggestions in relation how to deal with the address-based registration problems that's being thrown up? That people move very quickly. Young people could be at two different addresses, or studying, or working away from home. Some of them are living with a girlfriend, or back home in odd time when they fall out, or a boyfriend. There's huge sections of the population now, there's 300,000 households in private rented accommodation, which is very transient, as opposed to local authority rented accommodation, which tends to be more lifelong. How would you deal with that? And just the cross-boundary, that we say in the case of Laois Offaly, for example, are you registered in Laois, registered in Offaly? People are on the register sometimes in both counties. Then you find people who are not on it at all. Just how you would deal with that problem. And I'm mindful of, and one of the things in mind, along with, I suppose, a bit of a bias towards in favour of local government, is the local information that local authorities do have, and members of local authorities. But that, of course, as we mentioned here on previous days around this subject, is now broken down to some extent, because the rate collector's gone. There's 700 town councillors gone, and that does weaken that local intelligence gathering. And political parties, all political parties, probably don't have the same on-the-ground membership that they had, 40, 50 years ago, where, every crossroads there was somebody. But just how do we deal with that thing of multiple registration? I can see some of the benefits of, and accept some of the benefits of the local intelligence gathering is still there from staff and indeed the 949 members of local authorities. Adrian mentioned, in relation to the Electoral Commission, and the staffing out of it, and heading up of it, who should head up the Electoral Commission, Adrian, and how would it be selected? To try and have validation, because even the ad hoc boundary commissions, they don't always deal as the hand that we would like. Where a bit of another county is bitten off. In the case of Laois Offaly, we've inherited a piece of South Kildare that has no relationship at all to Laois. So I mean, some people would say, is there bias here, or how does this happen where's the accountability? And I don't know where the accountability is. One day we walked in here and there was a drawing, there was a map in your pigeonhole, and that was it, you know, and as elected people from Laois Offaly, you know, that's why he collected out of the pigeonhole, and how that was arrived at, I don't know. I have no idea how that was arrived at, and there's no accountability around that. So just who should, you know, I suppose in the first instance, who should appoint, who should be on those commissions, if it's taken in the Boundary Commission and SIPO and other tasks, and how would it be selected? Yeah, that's about it.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Stanley. And his first reply comes from
Helen.
Great. Thank you, Deputy Stanley. A difficult question, and I want to be as helpful as I can to the committee, but I suppose it's worth making the point that it wouldn't be up to the Data Protection Commissioner to make suggestions as to what the actual solution could be. We can assist in assessing the data protection and privacy implications of any solution that would be proposed. But in terms of suggestions that I would have that potentially could be considered by any executive body that's looking at this, it could perhaps be an enhanced version of the current registration system. What is the level of issue with the current system in terms of duplication and fraud, and could it be enhanced without using any additional personal data to improve the system and eliminate some of the problems? Other countries, and I don't necessarily suggest at all that these would be viable solutions or less privacy invasive, but other jurisdictions have looked at biometric data solutions. Another solution could consist of using different identity data, such as, for example, a passport and then a copy of a bill from the current address. So there may be other solutions or elements of solutions that could be considered. But there's no doubt the PPSN would certainly come into the mix. The national insurance number most recently has been used in the new UK individual electoral registration system. So there's no doubt that the PPSN would need to be considered as a viable solution. But within that, I suppose the point I was making is that we need to ensure that data minimisation principles are adhered to. For example, with the PPSN solution would be requiring that everyone validly on the current register has to re-register with their PPSN, or would a data matching exercise occur, for example, with the social protection database, to clear a certain percentage of those already on the register without the need for them to provide their PPSN, and only new registrants and those that couldn't be data matched would have to require it. So it's about the detail in terms of how the PPSN would be used that could dictate what level of data protection issues arise with it. I hope that's helpful.
And your other question, Deputy, directed to?
The AILG delegation, just in relation to, you know, trying to avoid or prevent multiple registration, you know, within a local authority or maybe in two separate local authorities. And the fact that, you know, what we're proposing, you know, doesn't deal with. I'm not sure that it deals with the problems with the address-based system, because of the fact that people are more transient now and the lack of local intelligence.
Okay, Mr. Devitt.
Yeah, I suppose you make two very good points, Deputy Stanley. People are so mobile nowadays. I suppose that is the big problem that faces us. Something that we have mentioned in our submission, that's why we feel that it's very important that the local councils, you know, they still have some input, because they would be aware of the history of people and different, you know, I suppose, different movement types in general. Tying people to their PPSN number is probably going to be a help, but I've no doubt about that if that comes out of this. But I think in general, like, it's quite complicated. If you want to change, I think it's an RF. I think it's a 4 form to change of address, and you have to get it stamped by the guard. So it's quite an onerous form to get someone to do it. So guys will stay on and register in some place. You know, they might register twice, maybe, and not bother telling or whatever else. So unless the person in the council picks up this anomaly, it's not going to change. You know, sometimes you have good people and staff that will pick it up and they will take the other person off the register and they'll check their date of births and all that, but A lot of time it doesn't happen. I suppose the worst thing with all, if they come off the register and they can't vote, is the bigger sin. If they're on it twice, which was touched on here either, that's why the numbers are so wrong, because people are multi-registered when they change house. There's piles of it, there's no doubt about that, and we see it as politicians out on the ground. So I think some tied to the PPSN number is probably going to be, definitely have to look at going forward.
And did you mention Dr. Cavan as well, Deputy Stanley?
Yes, please.
Yeah,
just in relation to the appointment of who would head up an election commission. Who would appoint them? To give it legitimacy and to remove any.
We might ask Sean Donnelly as well to answer that one as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, happy for you.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Like in relation to the Boundary Commission, I might just say, or the Constituency Commission, I might just say something that maybe like that's an interesting one, because there has been issues in relation to recent. We've had for instance, the last report for local election boundaries, where I think you had a commission of 5 or 6 people. Basically, had 6 months to redraw the entire boundaries across the country. I was on the previous commission, one of the 2 previous committees for the 2008 redrawing of the local election boundaries, and we had the same amount of time. The committee I was on was just looking at Dublin and the cities, and from my experience of it, like you had enough time to look at it, but you still make mistakes. What I would like to see with the 2 local election committees and also the Constituency Commission is that there's a bit more scope to actually review the Commission's proposals or committee's proposals in relation to this. I would like the idea of, I think this is the model to use in the United Kingdom. Instead of the Commission or the committee or committees producing the report and that's the end of it, at some stage early in the process, even before the public submission process begins in relation to boundaries, that the Commission or the committees, or both of them, produces a draft report or maybe 2 or 3 options. So if, for instance, if we say in relation to the last set of general election boundaries, if one of the proposals is suggesting that, say, you have an Offaly constituency with part of North Tipperary put in, at least there's some chance for a response to that. The other problem with the Commission and the committees is it effectively, I suspect, because maybe of the membership of the committee, maybe of the level of work when it comes to the local elections, it basically just becomes a numbers game. So you don't have enough people in Laois for a 3-seat constituency, you just add on enough to. And that might be something I suggest that might need a bit more thought put in. At the moment, the suggestion is you should try and ideally keep every constituency should have a population per TD within 5% of the national average, although in practice they've allowed variations up to 7.89%, which I think was Mayo East in 1983. That's one thing I'd like to tease out. That's something that probably hasn't been taught much. Like I suspect my sense of the Constituency Commission is they put a lot more emphasis on this kind of proportionality element and the continuity element than maybe the place-based or county-based element. They need, I think at present there's about, I'm sure Sean might have a better idea of this, the present general election boundaries I think breach 15 or 16 county boundaries, something like that. So maybe there needs to be a discussion on the extent to which proportionality should be seen as being more important to breaking or maintaining county boundaries, or maybe there might be some scope to discuss, is there a bit more scope to say, well, would we prefer to have a county constituency where our boundaries intact, even if it means the population is 10% too large, or should we try and keep in line with this idea of proportionality?
Chair, could I just make one point just in relation to the Boundary Commission? Just one of the things I thought was odd, and I accept that you will have to cross county boundaries to get, the preference I think should be for larger constituencies, 5 or 6 seat ones, but that's another day of sort. But I just want to think one of the things that could have been done and wasn't done by the Boundary Commission is to try and at least line it with the municipal district in the next county.
Yes.
Instead of just going in and biting out a piece out of 2 municipal districts, where you go in and you would have a county plus a municipal district in another county, where possible.
I think that's a very good point. In relation to your first point, Deputy Stanley, on the larger constituencies, Professor John Coakley in UCD carried out a very good piece of research a few years ago, which basically said if you had the scope to have larger constituency units, then you actually wouldn't need to move away from county boundaries. You'd have more scope to, if you'd say, for instance, if you had a 6-seat constituency, you might have been able to have had, say, a Sligo Leitrim Roscommon constituency without any need to draw in a part of West Cavan or a part of South Donegal to make up the numbers for the 4 seats Sligo Leitrim. Sorry, the other question, sorry.
Yeah, just in relation to the appointment of the Commission, who should be on it and how would it be selected or appointed?
Yeah, obviously I think